Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for this second PPP Hangout. Part of why we're doing a second one is because there is another round of stimulus. For many of us, that first round was not successful. I will tell you that for NMAC, we were not successful at being able to do it because our bank, Capital One, and I'll say this, did not get their act together to be able to accept applications. However, they have this time, so we are hopeful. We want to talk with all of you about your experience last time of what happened and what's going to be in this next package. Before we get started, though, I want to do a brief tutorial on how to do this. So if you go to the far right side of your screen, there should be a little box that says Go to Webinar Control Panel. And you'll see under the Go to Webinar Control Panel a section called Questions. This is where you're going to be asking questions of the panel after the PowerPoint presentation. In order to learn how to use that section, what we'd like you to do right now, if you don't mind, is put your name, your agency, and your city and state, just so that we can see who is on the webinar right now. So please go ahead and put your name and your agency. Chip, who do we have joining us?
So we have Murray Penner online.
Hey, Murray, how are you?
We have Anselmo Fonseca from AIDS United. We have Chris Rothermel from Help HIV. We have Gerald Gibson Jackson from My Brother's Keeper. Jeffrey Edwards Knight. Deborah Levine. Patty Kufi, Buddies of New Jersey, Hackensack, New Jersey. Let's see, Lindsay Bryant from Richmond, Virginia. So we have a lot of folks on today.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. We know that these kinds of webinars can be challenging. At the end of the webinar, you're going to get an automatic evaluation form. And what we'd like you to do is fill out that evaluation form and be as critical as you want to be. Part of it is that we're learning how to do this. And for some of us, at least for NMAC, this is a new way of training and a new way of managing and dealing with our constituents. And so we would like your completely honest advice about how is this going, and are you hearing and learning what you need to be learning, or should we be doing something differently? So this is a webinar that was produced by the Partnership to End HIV, STDs, and Hepatitis. And that includes the AIDS Institute, NASTAD, NCSD, and AIDS United. And so as part of the partnership, we've invited the representatives to join us. And so Emily, talk to us a little bit about how is NASTAD doing and what are the messages that you want to make sure we're sending to the field right now?
Thanks, Paul. NASTAD is working really close with state health departments as well as some local health departments, but particularly around the Ryan White program and ensuring that people have access to care. We're working really closely with AIDS drug assistance programs to ensure that people who have lost their jobs are able to access medication, working with them to ensure that social distancing is happening. So we do have a website on COVID and sort of everything that is happening with health departments. So please feel free to check that out and contact us if you're having any issues.
So Natalie, what is the address so that Chip can put it in the chat box so that everyone can see it?
It is a little long, but it's nastad.org/resource/COVID-19.
Great, thank you, I appreciate that. So one of the things that we wanted to do today was take an opportunity to introduce people in the movement to our collaboration in terms of working with a Washington firm to help push legislation through. And so Emily is the point person for this legislation, for this collaboration. Emily, do you want to talk a little bit about the collaboration that we're doing with Brownstein?
Sure. So the Partnership to End HIV, STD, and Hepatitis has been working with Brownstein for about 3 years now, working particularly around appropriations to secure funding for the programs that we know are really important to people who are living with or at risk of HIV, STDs, and hepatitis. Right now, we are also pushing for additional funding within the stimulus bills that are happening. You might have heard that there was $90 million for the Ryan White program and $65 million for HOPWA in the CARES Act, which is great. And we are hoping to see an even larger increase because we know that these programs will face significant burden with an economic recession. So that has been the focus of our work recently.
Good. Well, you know what? Rather than me, why don't you introduce our partners from Brownstein? So I think that would be a great thing.
Great. So today we're joined by David Reed and Matt McKissick. They're both wonderful experts. David has worked really closely with the partnership on our appropriations asks, and Matt is our expert on PPP, and he'll be explaining sort of everything that I don't know about it. So I'm really excited to hear him speak. So I'm going to turn it over to David.
Great, thank you both, and really just want to thank you again for the opportunity to work with the partnership and the organizations within the partnership over the last 3 years. It's really been a rewarding opportunity, and I think we've had some really terrific wins over the course of our engagement. And of course, we're in unprecedented times. So, you know, Emily really did touch on some of the high-level issues that we're working on. As she mentioned, a lot of the work that we do is on the appropriation side, focusing on those priority funding lines that have been identified by the partnership to ensure that those funds are getting to the right places across the United States to ensure that we can work to end these epidemics. And now our focus obviously is on ensuring that we see these resources going into the right places to address the things that are of special importance to these constituencies that we're working with. So again, Emily had mentioned we're joined by my colleague Matt here, who has been in the weeds on the PPP program, which is the SBA's loan program for nonprofits and small businesses weathering this storm in the wake of COVID-19. So he's been working closely with a number of others on our team just to make sure that clients like the partnership are plugged in and are aware of what the opportunities are. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to my colleague here who can get into the meat, and then we'll open it up to Q&A.
Sounds good. Thanks, David. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now so you guys can see my PowerPoint. So my name is Matt McKissick. I'm an associate with Brownstein out of our Las Vegas office, and I am on what we are calling the SBA Rapid Response Team. Our firm has assembled a group of people from around the country that are working with our DC insiders like David, who not only have intimate familiarity with what's going on in the Capitol, but also have in-depth experience with the bill itself. We had some influence on how some of the language was crafted. And so they are teaching the rest of us on the SBA team, and so that we can teach the rest of you. And as you guys can imagine, being here in Las Vegas, I mean, this pandemic has really just devastated our community here. It's pretty much brought our economy to a complete standstill with gambling and hospitality being closed. So it's really been rewarding to help businesses and nonprofits such as yourselves, you know, charitable entities that are so critical to helping the local community weather this storm, and to stay afloat and to educate them on the best ways that this bill can help them. So with that, let's go ahead and dive right in. So here's a quick overview of what I'm going to be talking about today, the different provisions of the CARES Act. I'm sure many of you are on the call today to hear about the PPP loans, which is it's gotten a lot of attention in the media. It's kind of the meat and potatoes of the stimulus package. It's a great program. It's, you know, they provide loans that are completely forgivable if you use the money the way that you're supposed to. But in addition to the PPP, there are economic injury disaster loans, which is meant to be sort of a quick cash injection into your operation. You can get $10,000 within a matter of days applying to that. It's sort of a less stringent showing to get that money. It's more flexible in how you use it, but you do have to pay it back. There are also various tax programs that employers can take advantage of. Employers can defer their employer contribution to Social Security taxes for the remainder of the year. There's also an employee retention tax credit that gives employers a certain amount of money for retaining employees. There's another tax credit program for paying employees while they're sick or taking care of others while they're sick. And then there's various unemployment benefits as well. So let's go ahead and dive right into the PPP. So as you guys heard, there was $349 billion originally allocated that was quickly exhausted. It only took 2 weeks. And we anticipate that this additional $310 billion that just got approved on Tuesday in the Senate, and which is likely to get approved by the House tomorrow, will become quickly available, possibly as early as Saturday, possibly Monday, depending on your bank's operations. It is first come, first serve. So, I mean, the most important thing is just getting your name in the queue. I know many of the people on this call have already applied and weren't able to get funding the first go around. And we expect that you will not have to reapply, but you should check with your banks on that. You should still be in the queue, and it's really just a matter of replenishing those funds to get them dispersed to you. In general, eligibility is based on size. So if you're an employer with 500 or fewer employees, you're qualified. That's based on the preceding 12-month average. There are a couple other standards that can be used. The SBA used what's called the NAICS code. It's the North American Industry Classification System. So if you don't meet that 500 number threshold, there could be some slight tweaks upward that would allow you to be eligible still. There's also revenue-based standards, but typically if you are 500 or less, you're qualified. You don't even need to worry about any of that stuff. And of course, one of the big, benefits of the new CARES Act was making nonprofits eligible, whereas they were not before. And even independent contractors and self-employed individuals are eligible now as well. So the amount of the loan that you can get is essentially going to be 2.5 times your average monthly payroll. All your payroll costs for the average 12 months preceding the disbursement of the loan. And payroll costs include pretty much all forms of compensation, wages, salaries, commission, any forms of compensation. It includes benefits in that, state and local taxes. It does not include employer paid federal taxes, and independent contractors are not factored in to that calculation. They are not technically your employees, and now that they are eligible on their own, they cannot be included in your calculations. Again, you use the 12-month average before the loan. Generally, we've been advising clients just bring all their payroll paperwork in from January 1st, 2019 to now. If you weren't in operation last year, the SBA has a couple different time frames that they can use to calculate your average monthly payroll. But generally, as long as you're in business by February 15th, you're eligible, and it's really just a matter of proving up what your payroll costs are. There are some affiliation rules that you should be aware of. So the SBA, to determine whether or not you actually are a small business, they will look at various ownership and control aspects of your business. So if more than half of your business is owned by another entity, then they will include that other entity's metrics as a part of your operation, so which might bump you out of that 500 employee range. So it's something to be aware of. There's also control aspects to it, which I don't think will apply to anybody on this call. Things like if you could prevent a quorum from happening, or if you would, control a sufficient voting block of shares, things like that. I don't think that's applicable to anybody on this call really, but things to be aware of. The affiliation rules do only seem to be applying to one level up, not to every level up in the corporate hierarchy, in the structuring of the business. And those affiliation rules are waived for specific industries, which again, I don't think will be applicable to anyone on this call, but franchises, restaurants and hospitality, those affiliation rules do not apply. Now, the application doesn't specifically ask about affiliations. They just ask this question 3 that you see on the screen here. And if you answer yes to that, then you have to provide an additional list listing out that information. Now, you do have to provide the list of all owners with 20% or more equity in the business that is the applicant. And some banks have been requiring, and they've been doing this at the SBA's direction, and we've actually been recommending it to other clients as well to just do, to provide a list of all ownership. If you can account for more than half of the ownership of your entity, then it will essentially just make the government's job easier, that you can essentially push aside those affiliation rules that I just discussed as far as ownership goes, and you will be approved quicker and you can receive those funds quicker. Now, you should be aware that the SBA and the Treasury are making it very clear that the burden of showing all of your qualifications are on you, the applicant, not on the bank. That was actually what made this program so expeditious, was that it essentially shifted the burden from the lenders onto the borrowers of proving up eligibility. Whereas it was the banks that used to have to determine eligibility and kind of be responsible for all that. Now it's on you, the applicant. So you will be certifying to various things in the application, and those certifications are being made under penalty of perjury. So you want to make sure that you are providing accurate information, you're being forthright and honest in how you're providing that information. Lying on it, if something is not accurate, could potentially expose you to a fraud or a claim under the False Claims Act. And I don't say that to scare anybody, but it is something to be aware of. I mean, that is the extent of the certification requirements. That is what the triggering that happens there for their enforcement of it later on. And I'm not saying this to scare anybody again. If you're unsure, if you're making a good faith attempts to provide the information, that's not fraud. I mean, fraud is intentionally trying to deceive the SBA. So if you think the information you're providing is accurate, but you're a little unsure, that's not fraud. Just do the best you can at filling out these applications and you should be fine. So how do you ensure forgiveness, which is the whole benefit to this PPP program? It's all about how you use the money. So your allowable expenses are on payroll costs, obviously as the name suggests, and rent and mortgage and utilities. So at least 75% of your loan needs to be used on payroll costs to maximize the forgiveness, which leaves the remaining maximum of 25% that can be used towards rent, mortgage, and utilities. As long as you stay within those thresholds, you will be eligible, assuming that you do not reduce your workforce or reduce their salaries. It's all based on maintaining the same level of pre-pandemic operation costs when you get the loan. So as long as you don't reduce your staff or reduce their salaries and use the money in the ways that I just described, you will be eligible to have the entire loan forgiven. Now, if you do reduce your staff or reduce their salaries, you have until June 30th to get them back up to the levels that they were pre-pandemic. As long as you do that, you will still be eligible for the full forgiveness. If you don't do that, your forgiveness will be reduced. It's a little unclear how much it will be reduced at this point. That's kind of one of the big remaining questions in this whole framework. The SBA has promised that they're going to provide additional guidance on that later on. But it looks like it will be somewhat of a proportional amount in the reduction of full-time equivalent employees over the 8 weeks that the loan covers compared to the pre-pandemic conditions. So what are the terms of the loan if you don't get it forgiven? It's a 1% interest with a 2-year maturity. You can defer the payments on that loan for up to 6 months. And you apply, as many of you already know, you apply for this through your bank. And we recommend that you use banks that already have experience with the SBA. There are SBA approved lenders, and of course the CARES Act expanded that pool of banks that can work with the SBA. But any bank that already understands the ins and outs of how the SBA operates would be preferable. And certainly bring in all your payroll documentation. Again, we've been recommending to just bring in all your payroll documentation from January 1st of last year to now if you have that. That's absolutely essential. And so the bottom half of this slide is very important. These are some good practice pointers to keep in mind for how to handle the funds that you receive. Essentially, you're going to want to treat it as a disbursement of loan that is going to be audited later on. If you can keep it in a separate bank account, that's preferable. The less you commingle this with other funds, the more clean you can show how you use those funds. And it will just make the forgiveness side of it later on much easier. What's going to happen is that you're actually a couple months from now going to apply for forgiveness. It's not an automatic part of the process now. Once you use the funding, you will then apply for forgiveness later on, and at which point the SBA will essentially conduct an audit of how you use those funds. So if you have it in a separate bank account, you can demonstrate exactly, you can account for every penny that you received. It will be very easily to prove up that you are eligible for the maximum forgiveness. And this probably isn't a problem for many on the call, but just know that your name will become public knowledge. It will enter the public domain. And I don't think that's an issue for everybody here, but there has been some interesting PR backlash for some entities that took some SBA loans that perhaps shouldn't have. But I think everybody on this call is exactly what the program was intended to do. So in addition to the PPP, there's economic injury disaster loans. And like I was saying earlier, these are quick cash injections into your operation. It's a much easier showing to make that show that you are eligible. You don't have to provide any of that payroll paperwork. You really just certify that you have suffered a substantial economic injury, which, you know, I would argue has pretty much everybody at this point. You can use the funds pretty much however you want. It doesn't have to be just for payroll costs. There's a maximum $2 million that the loan is capped at, and you can get $10,000 of that within 3 days of applying. So again, just a quick, you know, disbursement of cash to help you stay afloat. There's no personal guarantee, just a credit check, and the money's pretty cheap. For nonprofits, the interest rate is 2.75%. The loan is up to 30 years, and that $10K advance can be forgivable. If you obtain an EIDL loan earlier in the year, before April 3rd, you can actually roll that into a PPP loan that you're applying for now. So additionally, there's also the payroll tax deferral that I mentioned earlier. So all employers, there's no specific eligibility requirements for this, are allowed to defer their employer portion of the Social Security taxes that they are paying for the remainder of the year. Essentially, you can defer half of that into pay next year and the remaining half the following year in 2022. It's interest-free, and employers that do receive a PPP loan can defer those taxes up until the point that the loan gets forgiven later on this year. And this program was meant to work in conjunction with the next program I'm going to talk about, the Employee Retention Tax Credit. Now, this is a really helpful one for people who don't need money now and can afford to get the benefit of it later on, next year or the following year, in the form of a tax discount or refund. If you do this, you are not eligible for a PPP loan. So that is a big thing to consider. It's either this Employee Retention Tax Credit program or a PPP loan. You can't have them both ways. You're eligible if your business was shut down, either entirely or partially, if you were deemed a non-essential business, or if your revenue has dropped half compared to the same quarter last year, and you remain eligible up until your revenue increases to 80% of what it was at this point last year. The amount of the credit is essentially half of qualified wages, up to $10,000 per employee per quarter, so essentially capped at $5,000 per employee per quarter. And that tax credit is fully refundable. So if your tax credits in the aggregate are actually more than what you owe, you will get a check from the IRS for that amount, and that's always nice. There's also the pay leave tax credit, and this applies to employers that have 500 or less employees, measured at the time the leave is taken. And like the other tax credit, is fully refundable, and it's for the 2 weeks of paid leave that you are providing your employees. So the employer is entitled to $5,110 per employee if the employee is actually suffering from COVID-like symptoms, is either directed to remain in quarantine, is directed by a health advisor to stay in quarantine, or is experiencing those COVID symptoms. During their paid leave, they're entitled to their regular wages or rate of pay, and the employer will get that tax credit that you see on the screen there. Now, if it's somebody taking care of somebody else, then the employer is entitled to $2,000 per employee. and that employee is entitled to 2/3 of their regular wage or rate of pay. And lastly, there are several unemployment benefits that were either added or expanded because of the CARES Act. The CARES Act made several people that weren't normally traditionally eligible for unemployment now eligible, such as self-employed individuals, gig workers, independent contractors, that kind of a thing. It also extended certain state benefits for an additional 39 weeks, and the federal government has also bumped up the amount that you can get for $600 per week for the next 4 months. And it's just, you know, obviously it kind of goes without saying that if you receive a PPP loan and you bring people back on board, they are obviously no longer unemployed. There's been instances of some people trying to kind of have it both ways, and that's just not how it's really meant to work. But that pretty much covers it. So with that, I will go ahead and open it up for questions.
Great. Thank you all so much. Come on back, Emily. We'd love to see you. Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. This is the time where you get to ask questions. And what I'd like you to do is in the question section of the box, put your questions in, and Chip will read them off so that we can get started. But before I do that, let me ask a couple of questions. You talked about one of the programs as an alternative to the PPP. Can you, if you do not get into the PPP, can you then later on apply for that program?
Yes. Yeah, if you don't receive funds, if you're denied for whatever reason or the funding runs out, then you still have access to the Employee Retention Tax Credit Program. And if you don't get a PPP loan, I would highly recommend going that route. I mean, you know, a lot of people need money now, so the PPP is kind of the way to go for them. But if you can stay afloat and recoup some of those costs later on through the tax system, you should definitely take advantage of that.
And the loans that you were talking about that are at 2.75 interest rates for nonprofits, what was the maximum amount that they could get on that? And how is that determined?
So it's determined entirely on credit check. So the maximum EIDL loan, which is what you're asking about, is $2 million. It's capped at $2 million, and it's just based on your finances, your credit check. There's no personal guarantee. You don't have to put up any collateral for that. It's just kind of a standard loan with a very minimal showing that you have to prove up for your eligibility for it. It's really just showing that you suffered substantial economic injury, which again is pretty much everybody at this point in time, and you get the money quick. You know, that $10,000 that you can get within 3 days is a nice aspect to it.
And then you pay it off over 30 years?
Yeah, there's an up to a 30-year term, and you can, that's somewhat modifiable, but yeah, that's the general terms of it.
And there's not necessarily a balloon on it.
No, I think it's fixed interest rate.
Great, boy, that's amazing. So let's see if we have any questions. Oh, let me go to Emily first. Did you have any questions after that presentation?
No, that was really comprehensive. Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, no, I thought it was very good too. So Chip, do we have any questions from the people on the call?
We do. The first one we have is, can you speak about Secretary Mnuchin's requirement that for loans to be approved, employers must show that 20% of their business has been impacted by COVID?
Interesting. I haven't really heard much about that. It's that's not built into the act. The actual bill doesn't require that you show that 20% of your business has been impacted. No, the eligibility is based entirely off of the size of your business, including your nonprofit, and that's it. There's no other eligibility requirements that you're supposed to have to show, and that might be something that it's more on the lender side, because that is kind of one thing that's been kind of throwing a wrinkle into this whole framework, is that the lenders are at times requiring their own things to show and requirements that have to be met, but that is not something that is actually specified in the language of the act itself. So that might be an administrative thing that's happening on the SBA on the back end, which that's kind of been a source of a lot of the uncertainty around how this program is supposed to work, is that the bill at times sort of conflicts with the existing regulations for how the SBA is supposed to operate. But that should not be required, and I would actually advise to potentially push back a little bit if your lender asks about that. That's not something that is supposed to be required per the statute.
Just a couple of things for everybody. This webinar and your questions will be put on the NMAC webpage, so you'll be able to go back, as well as I'm hoping that we can post your PowerPoint presentation.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So next question, Chip.
This is a question of someone who's having issues with Bank of America in regards to this. I'm wondering if anybody else is having problems.
Everyone's having problems with Bank of America and with Wells Fargo. And I will be very candid with you and say that it's been, I'll say it's been a real shit show with them. And that a lot of people have been blocked out. So there are two things that I would say, but I'll turn it over to Matt and to David and to Emily maybe if they have a different answer. But my suggestion to you is this, that particularly for the Wells Fargo one, because of the capitation, that you go to other banks. You can apply at other banks. Now, the reality is that, well, David, Matt, why don't you talk about what's going to be happening with the set aside for small community banks through this program?
Yeah, so the new $310 billion that just got allocated for the fund, I think 60 billion of that, I hope I have that figure right, is dedicated just to small lenders. And a lot of our clients have had great success with going with smaller banks. Bank of America and Wells Fargo have been not only have they been inundated with these applications, which has just sort of clogged up their system, they also have been some of the banks to impose additional restrictions on applicants. Bank of America was one a couple of weeks ago that was only issuing these loans to business entities that had a credit account with them. So if you were just depositing checks, you didn't actually have a line of credit with Bank of America, they were turning you away, which was essentially penalizing applicants for, running a good business and not needing a line of credit. So it was things like that that have really kind of backfired on Bank of America. But yeah, I would recommend going with, if you don't want to use Bank of America, Wells Fargo, go with a bank that has knowledge of the SBA, if they are an SBA approved lender, and a local state bank seems to be more successful and just easier to work with generally. But again, it's going to be on a case-by-case basis. But yeah, Bank of America and Wells Fargo, I will echo what Paul said a second ago, and they have been a complete shit show for the most part.
Let me just say, and to anyone who's from Bank of America or Wells Fargo who is on this webinar, please feel free to call me. I would love to talk to you. But with that said, let me just also say one other thing, because NMAC with our Capital One Bank, when they weren't accepting, we started bank shopping. We started bank shopping and calling, like a lot of people we called the friend of an uncle who knows someone who has a relationship with this bank. And that's sometimes kind of the way we have to do it. And we found two local banks that we could work with, but we'd have to set up accounts. And so the other challenge that you have is that if you don't have an account with them, setting up a remote account can be difficult, but not impossible. And so I would strongly encourage you, this is, I don't think, Matt, do you think there will be another stimulus package, or is this going to be it for the PPP?
It's hard to say if it will be it for the PPP. There will be more legislation getting passed. I know some of our people up on the Hill have been talking about, so this is essentially phase 4 of the COVID relief response, and there are already talks of, phases 5 and 6 coming out later on. What kind of funding that will provide for the SBA is yet to be determined, but there will certainly be more legislation that's being passed as coronavirus response measures.
And they're already starting to, think about what those packages might look like. House and Senate are scheduled to come back in early May. So we'll likely start to see movement on those particular pieces of legislation once they come back, with the idea that they'll likely see some floor activity come middle or end of next month.
Good. Next question, Chip.
To follow up on the Bank of America question, and I think you may have already answered it, but point of, if you already applied with BOA and did not get a rejection, can you still apply again with another bank?
So you
Matt?
can. I would try to withdraw your prior application, because that is one of the things you cannot apply twice. You cannot get two PPP loans. And in fact, doing so would be problematic later on. It could potentially look like you're trying to double dip. And, as far as those certifications that you may go in the application, could be potentially fraudulent. So I would just make sure that we don't get two applications through two different banks to the SBA. But yeah, if you didn't get a loan last time around, your applications should still be active with the bank that you submitted it with, and you shouldn't have to reapply. If you want to use another bank, then I would withdraw that one. Make sure that you have confirmation that it has been withdrawn, and then reinitiate the process with another bank.
And I would just add something else. Do not assume because you applied in the last round that you're necessarily still in the queue. That I would definitely contact your bank to make sure and ask them, do I have to reapply, or do I get to keep my position because I was in the previous queue? Because I think the big challenge is that banks are all doing this differently. And so what I don't want you to do is say, well, the webinar that they did told us this, because the reality is that banks can do it any way they want. And so I think the most important advice that we can give you is to speak to your bank. And I think the lesson for all of this, for all of us, is creating business relationships with your business banker, so that we understand in the future how to better access these kinds of resources. Chip, next question.
At the moment, we don't have any further questions.
Great. So let me just do a couple of things, and then I think we can kind of end the webinar. So thank you, first of all, everybody, for joining us today. I guess what I would want to say first to Emily, is there any kind of closing things that as you are looking at the legislative agenda for the HIV and EHE work, what should we be aware of right now?
That's a great question. Thanks, Paul. I think, appropriations are continuing in their normal way. They are a little bit delayed, but we are still continuing to advocate for funds for EHE, as well as these sort of specialized COVID funds. So we'll probably hear more about the COVID response. As Matt said, and David also said, they're working on phase 5, 6. Now it will sort of depend on the kind of this pandemic and how things work out, but we'll probably see some movement on regular appropriations towards the later part of the summer.
David, can I ask you in response to that one, given the fact that we're going to be in so much debt after this, because what is it, $3 or $4 trillion of debt, what does that mean to the 2021 appropriations?
So, I don't think that it's necessarily going to decrease the the funds available for the funds that we are advocating for and pushing for, especially on the public health front. However, one thing that we are hearing, especially on the Republican side, is a bit of spending fatigue, which will more, immediately impact what the subsequent and later packages specific to COVID-19 are going to look like. So you're already seeing some pushback on the proposals coming out of the Democratic caucus on funds to go directly to state and local governments, and putting additional strings onto those. So I think you're going to see that more in the subsequent packages. However, again, you've mentioned 2-3 trillion. I think that those numbers are going to continue to go up because I think that the need is there. And in order for us to, stem the potential for a really, cataclysmic economic situation, they are going to need to continue to inject those bits of cash as well as loan programs over the course of the summer, I think, because I think a number of folks are seeing that the alternative is not really something that we want to face. So I think on the immediate term and for these upcoming packages, that's where we're going to start to see the reticence.
And what do you think the chances are of getting a 2021 budget?
I think that it's likely going. I think that it's likely going to be a series of CRs like we've seen in the past, and then the potential for there to be, a kick to after the election for any kind of a broader deal. Obviously, there are a number of things that must be passed, and there are a number of appropriations packages that must be passed this year for the upcoming fiscal year. A broad agreement, I think, is a bit out of reach at this point. There could be a come to Jesus moment and everybody comes together, but I think the more likely scenario is a series of CRs taking it to the post election.
Depending upon how we get to vote this year. Well,
that's right.
Thank you so much, everybody. Emily, is there any last words? Matt or David, any last words? Thank you all so much for joining us. Oh, Chip, did you have something?
No.
Thank you all so much for joining us. This will be online. We really appreciate it. And we wish you everybody the best of luck as you apply for the second round of funding, and keep us informed of how things turned out to you. And I want to thank all of our folks from Brownstein and the partnership for all of their support of this effort. Talk to you later, everybody. Bye.
Pleasure.